Hello and welcome to the Viewpoint with USI India, India's oldest think tank. This year, the US led war in Afghanistan has reached in its 20th and final year. President Joe Biden said the reasons for staying 10 years after the death of Al Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden had become increasingly unclear. The withdrawal of the American forces from Afghanistan is expected to complete much before the September 2021 deadline. Probably by July 4th, most of the US and NATO troops are going to leave Afghanistan. Is Afghanistan going to plunge again into a civil war? Or will the Afghan National Security Defense Forces be able to hold up the Taliban onslaught? Joining us in the program is Major General BK Sharma, Director of USI India. He served in Central Asia as India's defense attaché, has made numerous visits to Afghanistan, and has also been involved with India-Afghanistan bilateral dialogue. General Sharma, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Arvind. It's always a pleasure to be with you on the show. And today we are going to discuss on a very, very important issue which impacts everybody in the region, particularly India and Pakistan. So thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you, sir. Sir, first of all, I would like to ask you, in the wake of US NATO troops withdrawal, how is the scenario panning out in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. And what Taliban used to say, Americans have the watches and we have the time. And I think that is what is coming true. There is another cliche that Americans don't lose wars, they lose interest. And that is also seems to be coming true. Though Americans have declared victory, and they've also given another reason that their main focus is China, and the whole strategic brinkmanship is going to shift into the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, it is time for them to pack their bags from Afghanistan. But not many people are buying that kind of a rationale for their withdrawal. Simply, I think it's a fatigue factor that has set in, and they're looking for a dignified exit from Afghanistan. Now, this development is plunging Afghanistan deeper into a plethora of critical uncertainties, which need to be very critically examined and understood to make a very pragmatic kind of a prognosis on Afghanistan. Presently, what is happening that they have advanced the date of their withdrawal to end July, as you said, though there may still be some elements or residual forces which would be left there. They are in the process of withdrawing from 12 odd bases which are scattered all over Afghanistan. They have resorted to an anticipatory deployment in which they have moved their aircraft carrier Eisenhower to the area of Gulf. They deployed about 6 B-2 bombers in the aircraft carrier, and one special forces unit which is called the Rangers has also been deployed. This is in anticipation that since the date of withdrawal has been postponed from 1st May as was agreed earlier, so there is some kind of a fear that Taliban may start attacking, and therefore they want a very smooth and orderly withdrawal. So that is how the whole thing is starting. Now, in the meanwhile, what is happening? There is a full-fledged a conflict that is raging in Afghanistan, about 28 out of 32 provinces. And the most fierce encounters or battles are presently taking place in the 4 provinces. These are namely Laghman, Baghlan, Warduk, and Helmand. Some fighting is also taking place in the north in the area of Badakhshan, Kunduz. But there, the Afghan National Defense Security Forces have pushed back these Taliban forces. What is a matter of concern that in these 4 provinces I spoke about 36 odd security posts have been pushed back, and the Taliban modus operandi is that they are strangulating, they are surrounding these forces, they're cutting off their supplies, and then they get the local elders to negotiate with these security forces. And if they agree to hand over their weapons and equipment, then they are given a clean exit and they are not being harmed or they are not being killed. That is the strategy which is being followed. So the basic purpose of this is that Taliban are adopting a maximalist position, so that they want to capture maximum territory, threaten Kabul, and be in a better bargaining position at the negotiation table, so that they become a predominant force in any new dispensation which is coming up in Afghanistan. Now, as far as Afghanistan political dispensation is concerned, it is mired in some kind of ethno-regional polarization. There are problems within Pashtun clans and Pashtun tribes. There is a divide between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. Those issues have not been resolved. But on the positive side, there are some developments taking place, and I would like to flag two. One is there are initial talks of creating a united national council to resist Taliban takeover. And Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, who is 30 years old, he is also trying to galvanize some of the forces in North. With he's in talking with the warlords and all, and some kind of a national resistance front is being formed. Now, these are the developments which are taking place. How it pans out, we'll have to wait and watch. But my worry here is actually the dire situation of economy of Afghanistan. As it is, they are dependent 70% on foreign aid, and their total budget is about $11.5 billion, out of which they only generate up to $2.5 billion, and remainder money, that is about 7 billion for several years, they will need from the foreign donors. Whether that money comes or not, whether they're able to utilize that properly at the grassroots level, that's a moot point at the moment. Then you look at the youth bulge of Afghanistan. 60 More than 60% of the population is below the age of 25. Unemployment rate is more than 55%. If in this chaos these youth do not get jobs and their energies are not channelized, then they become an easy recruitment for these some of the terrorist outfits and all. That's a very big problem. Second is, the sustainability of suffering these casualties in Afghanistan. Since 2001, more than 47,000 civilians have lost their lives. There are about 3 million people who have been who've become refugees. They are in some of them are in Pakistan, others are in Iran, others have gone to Central Asian Republic. Even Americans have lost nearly 2,400 people, more than 20,000 have been injured. And the overall economy, both for security and the development, more than $2.26 trillion have been spent by Americans. But at the end of the day, the 20 years of investment in democratic process, we are appearing to be back to square one there. And there are three odd scenarios that I visualize. One is that there would be a heightened violence and continued fighting for times to come. And if the both sides are able to sort of not reach any conclusion, or there are no clear cut outcomes, and some kind of a fatigue sets in, then there may be some kind of an incentive for negotiations for a power sharing arrangement. If that doesn't work out, then there is a possibility of Taliban takeover of southern and eastern provinces, and contestation over some of these provincial capitals, particularly Kabul and the surrounding areas. And then if the National United Council or the National United Resistance Front, it doesn't take shape, then we will get, the warlords will get involved, and we'll get into some kind of what you call is a civil war scenario, but it will not be similar to what happened post the withdrawal of Soviets. The geopolitical scenario is entirely different. So that is my initial response to your question.
Sir, currently Afghan government controls nearly 50% of Afghanistan's area. 30% is controlled by Taliban and 20% is hotly contested between the Afghan National Security Forces and the Taliban. In recent weeks, we have seen that many tribal leaders and government officials have surrendered to Taliban. Pretty much all the major cities of Afghanistan have been surrounded by Taliban fighters. So, if you could please elaborate on how will the US support Afghanistan to resist the Taliban takeover?
This is a very important question. If you look at the whole history of this conflict after Americans came in 2001, initially when Americans came, they had very few boots on ground. It was mostly they had put their special forces people. The CIA people came and they hobnobbed with the warlords. They gave them a lot of money. And then the special forces unit used the laser designator, and it was mostly the Northern Alliance together with the air power of Americans, which caused a rout of Taliban. And then second important phase came in this entire battle was the Tora Bora, wherein Americans used overwhelming force. They wanted to kill Osama bin Laden, but he escaped the dragnet. And then all of them actually they escaped to Pakistan, and then Americans gave them enough time to sort of reconsolidate and recoup and reorganize themselves. Then came the surge capability. At one point in time, both Americans and NATO put together, there were 130,000 troops there, right? But there was no material difference on ground because the safe haven in Pakistan were not touched by Americans. Today, you have come to a stage when there is not going to be any significant presence of Americans there. Despite that, Americans are saying that we are not going to leave Afghan National Defense Security Forces high and dry, and we will keep giving them assistance. Now, what that assistance is, firstly, they would like to keep the Kabul airport open as international airport for international aid to come in, and some kind of assurance to the diplomatic missions there not to wind up. As you see that many embassies there have started thinning out their staff. Australians have closed down their embassy. It can press a trigger button and they can be exodus of the diplomatic missions there. So they want to keep, and they are in talk with Turkey to create some kind of a security force there for the protection of this airfield or the airport. They also, the mainstay of American presence and NATO presence there was a system of contractors. Besides the security forces, there were about 20,000 contractors, mainly about 6,000 Americans, 6,000 from NATO countries, and about 6,000 for Afghans. Now, these contractors are also being withdrawn. But there are talks today with Turkey to have some kind of a contractor-based force, which is managed by Turkey to look after the base and also undertake repairs and other logistic functions in support of Afghan National Defense Forces. As you would have heard, that the CIA is in talk with some local militias there, particularly son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, so that they have some intelligence available to them. There are talks for having regional bases, though Pakistanis have declined to have any bases, but I believe there are some secret talks that they will permit their air support airspace and also the ground access to Afghanistan. Talks are also with the uh, Uzbeks to give Termez, which is a very important airfield north of Afghanistan, in the territory of Uzbekistan, and also with Azerbaijan. But Taliban have made a very strong statement that any country that provides bases to Americans, they will be at war with us. So there is a reluctance or some kind of a hesitancy in some of the regional countries not to get embroiled in this tug of war. But Americans will definitely have what you call is over the horizon counterterrorism strategy, wherein they will use these bases in the Gulf region, use aircraft carrier, and un, release or unleash what you call is the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, UAV, and aircraft strike missions from these bases. Now, one of the main forte of Afghan National Defense Security Forces, their special forces. So there is a talk with Jordan to create a training base there, and these people from Afghanistan are sent there on rotational basis for training. They've also assured financial support. In fact, President Joe Biden has made a bid about 715 billion dollars as a defense budget, out of which maybe 3.6 billion may be earmarked for Afghan security forces. And just I think couple of days ago, they have pledged them about 266 million dollars as an immediate support. But this notwithstanding, to be in Afghanistan and undertake those missions is one thing, and to operate from far off bases is another. Here, the response time was anything between 45 minutes to 1 hour. There, the response time is going to be from 6 to 8 hours. So, most of these strikes are not going to be time critical, and that will very seriously impinge on the combat capabilities of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces.
In the last 2 years, 3 years, Taliban have gained a lot of territory. So, if you could talk to us a little bit about, tell our viewers first of all, explain us about the Taliban network, their strategy and their modus operandi, and their strengths and weaknesses.
See, there is a proper terrorist ecosystem which is operating in Afghanistan. To paint the whole Taliban with one brush is actually misleading. Now, what is this ecosystem? At the very apex level, they have these shoras, which are the highest authority, and the most important shora is Quetta Shora, which is in Balochistan. There are two shoras under it. One is Mirashah Shora, and Haqqani network is based there, their leadership. There are two important leaders there. The supreme leader, or what you call Amir, is Hibatullah Okhunzada, and the military commander is Sirajuddin Haqqani. They've also appointed the son of Mullah Omar as a military operation commander. Then other Taliban, they operate from Peshawar Shora. They are not part of Haqqani network, but they are aligned with them. Another Shora is in Mashhad, and this Shora controls those Taliban on whom Iran has good influence. There is talk of another Shora, what you call is Northern Shora in the area Badakhshan, which controls most of non-Pashtun Taliban elements there, right? So these are the apex level organization. Now, this terrorist network there broadly can be categorized in four clusters. One is of international jihadis like Al Qaeda, Islamic Jihad, who are actually the ideologues and the mentors of these other organizations. Then you have the Pak centric groups. And Pakistan, to keep the pot boiling, it has created many other non-state actors there, like it has Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Taiba, you call, Spy Saiba and
Spy Cyber.
Jangvi. But also there is a Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan, which is actually targeting Pakistanis. And there is a significant influence of Al Qaeda, Islam, what you call Indian subcontinent, and such like international jihadis on this, and they are adherents of this Wahhabi Salafi ideology. Then you have the Eurasian cluster, which has important groups like East Turkestan Islamic Movement, the Uyghur militant outfits, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, which operate in Central Asia, and such like other groups. And the last is Afghan Taliban, which has 8 groups within it, Haqqani network being the largest one. So these are, now let me get on to Haqqani network, which is the major group. Uh, as per estimates, its strength presently is about 65,000 hardcore workers, and they have a very young age profile, about 16 years to 25 years. After they become 25 years, they're eased out and there is a fresh recruitment. Now, these people mostly operate from Pakistani safe haven. They come, deploy, undertake operations, and after that they go for rest and relief, and they are relieved by new set of units and battalions. Embedded in the civil society of Afghanistan are about 1,50,000 Taliban militias who are part and parcel of the civil society. They gain intelligence and they actually are some kind of an interface between Taliban hardcore leadership and the civil society there. They have these shadow organizations which are operating, and these are provincial and district level, what you call the governors. They have the commissions for ulma, justice, education, health, finance, some of the NGOs, and most of the times, whatever resources are appropriate used by Afghan government, they take stock of these resources and they utilize under their overall guidance. Those resources are utilized for whatever betterment are there. They have no dearth of money. Most of the money is coming from poppy cultivation. In fact, the areas which are controlled by Taliban, 54% of the poppy of Afghanistan is cultivated in those areas. They've also taken control of some of the mineral rich areas, and there is a thriving illegal mineral trade which is taking place. For weapons and equipment, besides buying weapons from the deserters, they also get weapons from Pakistan. There are reports of them getting weapons from Iran and even, say, from Russia and some other countries. So there is no dearth of weapons. In terms of their overall ideology, they very staunchly believe in Nizam-e-Mustafa, that Afghanistan should be a Sharia-based society and it should be an emirate. They are not going to sort of compromise on that. And they have this long-term strategy, and now following this strategy of strangulation, that means you sever the main arteries connecting the provincial capital. You go for the strangulation of district and provincial capitals, and then they are presently inching towards Kabul. They're just about 80 kilometers from Kabul. But there are problems within them because they are not a monolith. So there is a difference of opinion between the ideologues and the field commanders. Most of the field commanders, they think they are winning, and therefore there is no need for them to have any peace dialogue, and they should form the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. So there is a fear, if this Taliban leadership shows too much of inclination for intra-Afghan dialogue and power sharing arrangement, there could be desertions within their rank and file, and some of them actually join the Islamic State of Khorasan province or some other outfits. So this is another risk factor which further complicates the security scenario and even management of Taliban ranks within.
Okay, likewise, if you could also please talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Will they be able to hold on to the Taliban onslaught? Some say that they are actually losing out on that battle because, as I said earlier, Taliban every day is gaining momentum and gaining a lot of territory.
See, right from the beginning, it was a strategy of Afghan security forces to dominate the arteries and to take care of the district and provincial capitals. And they had left the hinterland to Taliban, right, in the this thing, because in terms of population, Taliban did not control too many populated areas. But it goes to the credit of these security forces that since January 2015, 95% of the operations against Taliban have been undertaken by them. Right. And it is only from time to time when cities like Ghazni or Badakhshan or Kunduz, these cities, these were surrounded by Taliban. That time the American support came. But Americans had actually since January 2015 stopped giving them any direct assistance. It was only the advice, some reconnaissance, and airstrikes. Presently, their strength is about 300,000, and Afghan National Army is divided into five corps, which are in different parts of Afghanistan. Then there is an Afghan Kabul division, which takes care of the green zone in Afghanistan. They've also restructured their police in a manner that the police deployment is in concert with the army deployment in different areas. Earlier, they had these auxiliary units and they had performed very poorly. They were surrendering to Taliban. Then they raised Afghan national territorial armies, which are much better trained and they are holding the ground there. But the prima donna of Afghan security forces are two components. One is their special forces, which has about more than 30 companies, and they've given a beautiful, very good account of themselves, and is their air force. This is a nascent air force. They have light combat aircraft, some UAVs and helicopters, but they've done extremely well. Now they are in the process of raising people's militias. In the past, these people's militias were controlled by warlords, but there is a mass recruitment, and these peace militias are now working in tandem with the core commanders right up to battalion level, which is a very positive development. Their overall strategy, as I had explained earlier, is to focus on the political centers, the communication centers, and not go too much of jungle bashing into the hinterland and try. That stage can come subsequently. But they have certain weaknesses, and what are those weaknesses? They are technologically deficient force. They do not have the digital technology, the electronic warfare. They do not have good logistic capabilities, casualty evacuation, the artillery, support, and the laser designators and such like things, which came from Americans. Now, in the absence of American presence there, this cutting edge technology based operations are going to take a hit. Another important issue is that they've suffered tremendous casualties, more than about 70,000, and this casualty rate is not sustainable. There are leadership crises there, there are certain desertions there are issues of training and all which need to be addressed. But on the whole, I think if Americans support them even as part of over the horizon strategy, these people are highly motivated. And if the political elite is able to find some kind of a united front, then their morale and motivation will be there to work. The only biggest critical vulnerability of these forces is their very delicate ethnic composition. And what is that ethnic composition? Nearly 44% are Pashtuns and 56% are non-Pashtuns. And both in the army and in the police, the top level the leadership position are occupied by Tajiks, who are in significant number because of Taliban were predominantly a Tajik, no, the Northern Alliance was predominantly a Tajik force. So, if the political polarization takes place on ethnic lines, it may eventually percolate down to the rank and file of Afghan National Defense Security Forces. And if that polarization takes place, then there is a risk of state collapse. If that doesn't happen, I think they will be able to withstand a total takeover by Taliban.
Do you feel that the Americans should leave some heavy equipment behind for the Afghan security forces to use?
See, they've already done that. You know, there are three kinds of things they've done. Some of the very costly equipment, which has very high end technology, they have dismantled and taken it. Similarly, some of the infrastructure, which were housing some very secretive element, the equipment, those structures are also being dismantled, because if those structures fall in the hand of China or Iran or any other enemy countries, they will be able to assess what kind of weapons were deployed there. But the other weapons like your ICVs, Humis, and these kind of weapons, these have been handed over to Afghan security forces. The problem is that of spares, because all this equipment requires regular maintenance and a very sustained supply of spares. If that is not coming in due course of time,
Sir, I think your video got stuck. The problem, and after that I couldn't hear anything. So maybe start from there.
Mhm. So the problem is whatever equipment they handed over to Afghan security forces is its maintenance. Is it about supply of spares? We had given them 4 helicopters, and we could not supply them the spares for those helicopters, and they overused those that equipment, and after some time it got grounded. So if that doesn't happen, then this equipment it will have a certain shelf life, and due to battle fatigue, this equipment will not be usable if it is not replaced. Whether those assurances are coming from US, I doubt very much that they would do this.
How will the scenario in Afghanistan impact Russia, China, Iran? What would be their role?
See, if you look at the geographical boundaries of Afghanistan, you have nearly 2,600-kilometer Durand line, which is contentious. Then they have an open porous border with Afghanistan. But the most porous border is with three Central Asian republics: Tajikistan, a short border with Uzbekistan, and then you have a longish border with Turkmenistan. Now, these are very, very porous borders. So, the first effect I would say of this could come to Central Asian republics. Some of these militant outfits have traditionally been using the bases in northern Afghanistan. For example, Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, which took part in the civil war there from 1992 to 97, they had their bases in Afghanistan. Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, who wanted to topple Islam Karimov's government, they operated from 1999 till about 2005 from northern Afghanistan. So these kind of outfits can get rejuvenated and start striking the critical infrastructure in Central Asian republics. And most vulnerable is Rashid Valley in Tajikistan and Fargana Valley, which encompasses the territory of 4 Central Asian republics there. But Russians are quite strong there. You know, Russians have the collective security treaty organization with these countries. Under that, they have about 15,000 rapid reaction forces. There is a motorized division which is deployed on Tajikistan Afghanistan border. There are 2 air bases from which Russians are operating. One is Aini base in Tajikistan, and second is Kent Air Base in Kyrgyzstan. They've also got what you call is the regional anti-terrorist center located in Bishkek. So they would be quite in a position to prevent an onslaught, but sporadic incidents of terrorism in Central Asia cannot be ruled out. Likewise, there are problems, in the past, whenever Taliban came to power, they had killed a lot of Hazaras and they're still targeting Hazaras. And they had even killed some of the Iranian diplomats in the cities of Herat and Mazar-e Sharif. So Iran also gets affected with this. And then is, of course, Pakistan. Now, what would basically be the strategy of some of these countries? As far as Central Asia and Russia are concerned, I think they will use a very strong hedging strategy along the CIS Southern Security Belt, that is, means the northern Afghanistan. And they have already said they are not in favor of an emirate and they want a representative government there. And they would come to the help of that representative or power sharing dispensation in terms of railroad connectivity, in terms of providing them alternate corridors, and some aid for reconstruction of Afghanistan, particularly supply of the electricity and such like things. As far as Iran is concerned, to me it appears they will recalibrate their strategy of dealing with the Taliban. They do not want a Wahhabi, Salafi, encirclement, because they have a problem of Kurdistan, the PKK movement on their borders with Iraq and Syria. Now, if another ideological based organization comes to power here, that will create a very big problem for Shia Iran. So they would like to sort of renegotiate and relook at the whole strategy and would not be in favor of a total, purely a Taliban dominated government in Kabul. They have already assisted them in their academic institutions. There is a railway line which has come from there. They're supplying them power and things like that. That kind of assistance will continue, but they have certain concerns, other concerns like this damming of some of the rivers from Afghanistan into Iran. So they would have a certain concession extracted from the new dispensation, but their strategy will be very, very nimble footed.
So Pakistan has clearly said that it won't allow its territory for any operations in Afghanistan. This means there won't be any boots on ground nor any drone operations operating from Pakistan. If a civil war breaks out or if something goes wrong in Afghanistan, how do you see its impact on Pakistan? In past, we have seen the influx of refugees coming into Pakistan. Already there is a refugee problem. Nearly 3 million refugees are living in Pakistan. So how do you view the changes in Afghanistan impacting Pakistan?
Uh, See, the biggest elephant in the room has been, is, and will remain is Pakistan. Their entire strategy of Afghanistan is India centric. And this was told to me by no less than General Nicholson, whom I met in Kabul. He said during my talk with the Pakistan Army chief, they said, well, we can cut corners anywhere, we can accommodate, we can sort of recalibrate. But I mean, our strategy in Afghanistan is going to be India centric. Now, what was that India centric strategy? There was some kind of a heightened fear of encirclement because of India's popularity there. We had about 5 consulates operating there. We had spent about $3 billion, and India is a hugely popular country in Afghanistan, cutting across the ethnic spectrum with all segments of society there. Now, while Pakistan has been at the high table in terms of these negotiations and its role is very, very significant. At this juncture, while it may bask in the glory of a tactical victory, but its strategic dilemmas are going to get compounded. And the reason for that is, one is that its Durand line dilemma is not going to evaporate. When Mullah Omar was at the helm of affairs, there were very serious overtures made by Pakistani establishment to settle the question of Durand line. And he said, over my dead body, this is not my single issue, it's an issue of Pashtun nationalism, and so only this issue can be decided by Loya Jirga. So that with no matter which Taliban comes to power, this issue is not going to be settled. The second issue is this Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which has become very, very popular. And this is one movement which calls a spade a spade. It has put ये जो दहशत गर्दी है इसके पीछे वर्दी है. They are in confrontation with the Pakistan army, and this movement has very good resonance in Afghanistan as well. So there is a good, scope for this reason to this movement to resonate on both sides of Durand line and compound this Pakhtunistan dilemma of Pakistan. The third issue is Tehrik-e-Taliban of Pakistan has become extremely active in Balochistan. They've gone for targeting there. There are also the Baloch resistance groups which are into targeting. So the new frontier of this terror is going to be Balochistan, which is going to haunt Pakistan in a very, very serious manner. Now, these are some of their problems, and then of course, if there is a civil war, more refugees will come. More refugees come, they will become the factories of recruitment for jihad, and the first line where this jihad will be unleashed will be in the Pakistani cities and in their townships. So this is a problem for them. If on the other side, if this unified council, national council comes into being and there is a new unified national resistance group, now most of the elite are not favorably inclined towards Pakistan. So again, Pakistan will remain a bad guy, like people like Vice President Saleh and even Ashraf Ghani. They have not, held their punches. They're putting the blame, the whole blame on Afghanistan, Pakistan. And as long as those safe havens remain in Pakistan, Afghans will keep blaming it for cross-border terrorism. Now, what Pakistan is likely to do is that probably they will go for a situation which is not purely a Taliban dominated government, but more representative government in which Taliban have a major say. And then they would like to create what you call a shared economic and security zone in the southern and eastern provinces of Afghanistan and put some of these shoras into that territory so that they can tell rest of the world and FATF and particularly Americans, we have nothing to deal. They're all now based in Afghan soil and you deal with them. But there would be problems. Its problems are never going to settle down, and I think it is in for a long term trouble. How Pakistan recalibrates its strategy, how does it copes up with these challenges which are in the offing, time only will tell us.
Sure. I would also like to ask you what is India's role in the Afghan peace process? And in the post conflict era, what would be the key challenges and opportunities for India? Will the Indian government be able to invest in some sort of relationship between the Ashraf Ghani government if it continues to remain in power? Or let's assume that even if Taliban comes into power, how would Indian interests be protected in Afghanistan?
India is the most popular country in Afghanistan. In fact, during my visits there, when you go to the airport, they don't even look at your passport. The moment you say, I'm an Indian, uh, whereas Pakistanis keep hiding their faces there. Most of the Pakistanis, they portray themselves to be Indians there. That's the kind of popularity because we've helped them a lot. And while we had supported Najibullah and Soviets, but subsequently, when this Mujahideen government there was formed, and subsequently there was a fragmentation during the Taliban regime and post its exit. India became a very popular country. It was embraced by most of the Mujahideen leaders, and today we have very good relations with Dostum, be it the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, be it General Atta, or for that matter, Hikmat Yar. So we are in touch, though we've not directly talked to Taliban leadership, because the backbone of Taliban leadership is Haqqani network, and they are de facto a proxy of Pakistan. So there is no point in
Absolutely.
talking to them and getting into some embarrassing situation. But there are a number of other Taliban leaders we are in touch with, and we don't have to tom about it. But we have been steadfast in that whatever happens in Afghanistan, it should be Afghanistan owned, Afghanistan led, and Afghanistan controlled. And we favored the democratic process there, and we have supported the democratically elected government there. And that is what we are going to say. If tomorrow the people of Afghanistan, through intra Afghan dialogue, decide that no, we need a power sharing arrangement with Taliban, and that is endorsed by the people of Afghanistan and by Loya Jirga, India has no qualms with it. We will support them, and we will offer all our services and experience. If we spend money in the civil capacity building, in power projects, in their that Salma Dam, in the Parliament buildings, creating a cricket stadium, having these land and sea-based trade corridors, organizing international business forums for them. We'll continue to do that. We will invest into their institution buildings and other things. But at the same time, we cannot be complacent about the ensuing or the evolving geopolitical developments. There are risks involved there. And some of the critical uncertainties we need to watch very carefully are, first and foremost, is who will there be a ceasefire or will there not be a ceasefire? Who will be a guarantor of that ceasefire? There is no clarity on that. Second issue is, how do you disarm and demobilize the armed cadres? But there is no clarity on that, right? How do you reconstruct or reconstitute the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces? Something on the lines of what happened to Maoists in Nepal. Then come the other issues of what the power sharing arrangement is, what kind of amendments they want to the constitution of Afghanistan, what effort goes into the institution building and things like that. So we'll have to watch. But from our perspective, right, in the past also, we were sort of nudged by Americans to play a more active role. And there were many lobbies, they were saying that we should put boots on ground. We had flatly refused that. And I don't think India will put boots on ground unless, as Ashraf Ghani and even now Americans want that United Nations Security Council to take a lead role. If the whole peace building process and that I would say the architecture revolves around United Nations, then India we can play a major role in that as part of UN under the flag of UN. And then if there is a new government that is there, we would be more than willing to invest more and more in the peace and security of Afghanistan. At the moment, our main concern should be that any new regime which comes in power there, and suppose with a nudge from Pakistanis, they want to target our mission, people working on projects. So we to have to security arrangement tied up so that we don't run into Kandahar like a very, I would say, embarrassing situations there. So first is our preservation there. Wait and watch the situation. Encourage intra-Afghan dialogue and the democratic process. And we should also be careful that there is a talk very recently, the foreign ministers of Afghanistan China and Pakistan have met, and they said we will sort of give more and more aid there. There were talks in the past of creating a Pakistan China condominium there for investment in Afghanistan. If that means exclusion of India, we'll have to play a diplomatic clout to see that India doesn't get excluded there in any new dispensation, because that will undermine our strategic interests, which are paramount, be it our outreach to Eurasia, Central Asia, or seeing that Afghanistan doesn't turn out to be another epicenter of, Wahhabi, Salafi kind of a radical Islam. In the past, it has affected us in India, in Jammu and Kashmir, and we don't want these proxies to be trained there and to be used against India. So at the moment, I think our strategy is very sound. It is very nimble footed. We have our ears to the ground, and we are playing our cards in a very, very, I would say, astute manner. And we will have a very bold Afghan strategy in times to come, depending upon what the outcomes there. We have also pledged to support the Afghan National Defense Security Forces. In the past, we've given them helicopter gunship, some other aid. We train about 1,000 of their security forces personnel in our academy. Some beds for the war casualties have been earmarked in our hospitals. We're giving scholarship to the martyrs' children in our institutions. There is a very important ITEC program, medical visas, scholarship in our educational institutions. We'll continue with that, maybe with the added vigor. But at the same time, we have to be very mindful about our own security concerns. And we very strongly believe in a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan, and we will leave no stone unturned to for that to happen.
Some say that Taliban will not repeat the costly mistakes, like what they did in after the 9/11 attacks by siding with Al Qaeda. Do you feel that their supreme leader Hibayatullah Akhundzada will he try and form some sort of relationship with Al Qaeda? Because that's the underlying perception at the moment, that they haven't really cut off their ties with the Al Qaeda operatives.
There is a difference between the Taliban as we saw them in during 1994 and when they were in power from 96 to 2001, and the Taliban that we see. While their ideology may not have changed, but their modus operandi has undergone a change. That time, they came to power because of the infighting within Mujahideens, and there was so much of bloodletting and chaos that people saw them as a savior and they accepted them. But when they started showing their true colors, and particularly the way they went against the women and imposed very stringent and archaic some of these Islamic laws, then people were quite fed up and they became very unpopular. And that is why the moment the Northern Alliance came, there was a rout of Taliban because they had no acceptability. Uh, Taliban had learned a lot of lessons from that. And today, this Taliban is far more sophisticated and savvy in dealing with the rest of the world. There is a degree of legitimacy they have from all the major powers and other European countries. They also need diplomatic support to be recognized as a legitimate power. They need international donors for the peace building in Afghanistan. So they are very different. Now, while in the past they had said that they've feared their relations with Al Qaeda, but they kept supporting and hiding Osama bin Laden, at the moment, again, there is a fear that they have not shared all the thing because they are not very certain about the outcomes. But to me, it appears once they are entrenched in power, probably they will declare a territory and they won't like to have liabilities like Al Qaeda and things like that. And they are quite capable of weeding them out. There are not more than about 500 these foreign terrorists there, and it's not very difficult for Taliban to weed them out. But more worrisome is Islamic State of Khorasan province, you know.
Mm.
That is going to be a bigger nuisance than Al Qaeda. And they will have to make certain statements that, well, whether they fight together with Americans and other countries and Taliban, Afghan security forces against Islamic State of Khorasan province, it's very difficult to categorize who is with whom. Many places, Taliban and ISKP, they fight together, particularly in northern Afghanistan. And in southern Afghanistan, they are fighting against each other. So that is the biggest problem, and not, I think, Al Qaeda, etc., because they won't like to invite the wrath of Americans all over again. This time over, they would probably look for a little more, I would say, a more accommodative form of Sharia. And there are talks already, you know, in Pakistan that we should look at some moderate Sharia kind of a thing, moderate Islam. It should be Sharia, but more moderate and more tuned with what is happening in rest of the world. So I don't visualize the Taliban embracing these Al Qaeda like outfits the way they had done in the past.
What are some of the critical uncertainties that will impact on the future of Afghanistan?
First is the ceasefire.
Mhm.
Who is the guarantor of that ceasefire? Second is demobilization and disarming of militant cadres. If they are not disarmed, they don't know anything else except fighting. That is, how do you mainstream warlords? They will have their own pie of the cake. Then next issue is what is their vision? Nobody, Taliban have never articulated a vision for Naya or new Afghanistan. What is going to be their domestic policy? What is going to be their foreign policy? What is going to be their economic policy? There is no clarity on that. Then is the constitution of Afghanistan. What kind of constitution? What is the power sharing arrangement? As you know, in the past, even when there was an elected government, there were problems between Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, the CEO and the president, and now he is the president of the High Peace and Reconciliation Council. There are differences there. Now, what? Well, they be able to gel together, or after some time they will start falling apart. Those are some of the other areas. Then is the international aid. If
Yeah.
that aid doesn't come, and if it is not funneled and channelized properly, and it doesn't reach the grassroots level, then what happens? The people will be deprived. Then is the poppy cultivation there, you know. A big, 2/3 of their agriculture economy is based on poppy. What is their program? How do you ensure that the right people at the village level, the farmers and all, are benefited and they start growing alternate crops? Institution building. If the institutions are not built, now on what basis? Will it be based on the principles of democracy? Will these be based on Sharia? These are the kind of critical uncertainties for which we do not have a clear-cut answer, and that these, if these are not resolved, then this will keep impacting us lasting the prognosis of a lasting peace in Afghanistan.
How does the civil society in Afghanistan now view the democracy now that they've had a taste of it for the last 20 years?
See, there are large number of surveys which have been carried out, and all these surveys point out for a very popular sentiment for the democracy. 80% of the people do not want to live under an emirate or an Islamic Sharia. They want an Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, but under the democratic tenets. That's the sentiment. That is one reason that Taliban do not want to participate in the election process, because they know that they will actually lose in the election, and that will undermine their legitimacy. Presently, the women empowerment has been very praiseworthy in Afghanistan. They are in significant numbers in the parliament, holding some very influential positions. They also in the intra-Afghan dialogue delegation. Uh, so they don't want now that women empowerment to take a backseat. And no matter what assurance Taliban give, that they will give them some kind of rights under the Islamic law, but that is a glib talk,
Hmm.
because whichever areas are being dominated by Taliban, they have started imposing strict parda system there. They've said that women will not go to the schools, they will not be moving unescorted or going to the jobs. So, like the banning of music, even sort of shaving and such like things are being imposed. So I do not see that there would be too much of change of attitude of Taliban towards women, and that will add to the resentment in the civil society. You remember last time when there was a ceasefire on the eve of Eid, most of these Taliban cadre, they came, they started taking selfies with their civil population, with soldiers, and they started taking ice cream and all. This got Taliban worried that if this is the way they start intermingling with the civil population, probably that fire which is in their belly to fight will actually die down, and they will get civilized. So they don't want that these kind of things. I think they will be hung up on this Islamic Sharia, not reconciled to a democratic system, and that is what is going to irk the Afghan civil society.
General BK Sharma, thank you so much for the in depth analysis on the constantly changing security scenario in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Arvind, and look forward to more episodes with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.